The scream came before the music even stopped. Guests in silk gowns and pressed suits froze mid-laugh as a palace maid burst through the ballroom doors, her face pale as bone. She did not speak. She only pointed toward the East Tower, where the newlyweds had gone only an hour before to begin their first night as husband and wife. Within minutes, guards were running. Chandeliers still glittered above tables covered in half-eaten cake and champagne glasses left standing. Nobody understood what was happening. One moment the kingdom of Varnholm was celebrating the wedding of the century. The next, servants were whispering a single word that spread through the halls faster than fire. Gone. Princess Ilara Vantry, married only hours earlier to Crown Prince Damien Ashcombe, was gone from the honeymoon suite. The heavy oak doors had been locked from the inside. The windows were shut. And on the stone floor of the balcony, caught on a broken piece of railing, hung her wedding veil, torn at the edge and marked with a dark red stain that no one wanted to name aloud. Prince Damien stood in the doorway of the suite, still wearing his wedding jacket, staring at the empty room, as though his mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. He called her name once, then again, his voice cracking each time. The silence that answered him was worse than any scream could have been. Guards searched every corridor, every staircase, every locked cellar beneath the palace. They searched the gardens where fireworks had lit the sky only hours earlier. They searched the stables, the chapel, even the old wine cellars that had not been opened in years. There was no trace of the princess anywhere. It was as if she had stepped outside the world itself. By the time the sun rose over Varnholm, the wedding banners still hanging from the palace gates looked less like a celebration and more like a cruel joke. The kingdom that had gathered to watch its future queen marry its future king now woke to headlines asking a single, chilling question. Where is Princess Ilara? Inside the palace, panic moved quietly, but urgently. King Alaric, Damien's father, ordered the entire wing sealed off before word could spread further. He walked the length of the corridor outside the honeymoon suite 3 times that first hour, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, saying almost nothing to the guards and advisors trailing anxiously in his wake. He was a man known throughout the kingdom for his steady temperament, yet even he could not fully mask the tremor that had crept into his voice by the time he finally spoke. "Find her," he said simply. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, find her before the sun sets twice." Queen Isolde, Damien's mother, stood a short distance away with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. She did not cry. She did not ask questions. She only watched the guards work, her eyes sharp and calculating in a way that unsettled the younger staff around her. More than one servant would later admit, quietly and only to trusted friends, that the queen's calm that morning had felt less like composure born of strength, and more like the practiced stillness of someone already several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Nobody dared say what everyone secretly wondered. Had the bride run away on her own? Had she fallen, or been taken, from that high balcony in some terrible accident no one yet understood? Or had something far darker happened behind those locked doors, something the palace itself might already know more about than it was willing to admit? The royal physician, an elderly man named Godwin who had served the family for nearly 30 years, was the first to examine the veil. He turned it over carefully in gloved hands, studying the stain that had dried into the delicate lace. It was blood, there was no doubt about that, but something about the pattern troubled him. It was not smeared, as it might be from a struggle. It was almost deliberate, as though it had been placed there rather than spilled in violence. He held the fabric up toward the morning light streaming through the tower window and frowned, turning the veil this way and that, searching for something his decades of experience told him should be there, and yet was strangely absent. He said nothing of his suspicion to the guards. He only wrapped the veil carefully in a length of clean linen and carried it to the king himself, who examined it in silence for a long moment, before locking it away in a drawer in his study, as if hiding it could undo what it represented. Godwin lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, as though he wished to say something further, some observation about the stain's strange precision, but the weight of the king's grief silenced him, and he bowed his head and withdrew without a word. Meanwhile, whispers began traveling through the palace staff like a fever. A young kitchen worker swore she had heard footsteps on the servants' staircase near midnight, far heavier than a woman's steps should be. A stable hand claimed he saw a cloaked figure slip through the garden gate just before dawn, moving with purpose, careful to avoid the torchlight. A laundress insisted she had seen a light burning in the old lighthouse tower on the palace grounds, a tower that had stood dark and unused for as long as anyone could remember. Nobody knew if these stories were true, half-remembered dreams, or simply fear finding shape in the darkness. But each retelling added another layer of dread to a night that had begun with such joy. By mid-morning, journalists had gathered outside the palace gates, their cameras aimed at the towering iron doors that had, only the night before, opened wide to welcome a new princess into the kingdom. Now those same doors remained firmly shut, guarded by soldiers who offered no comment, no explanation, nothing but silence. Among the crowd of reporters stood a sharp-eyed young woman named Priya Ashford, who wrote for one of the capital's smaller but increasingly respected papers. Unlike many of her colleagues shouting questions toward the guards, Priya stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, watching the palace windows carefully, counting which lights burned and which remained dark, noting every carriage that entered or left through the side gates. She had learned long ago that the loudest questions rarely produced the most useful answers. Inside, Prince Damien sat alone in the room where he had promised to spend the rest of his life beside his bride. His wedding jacket was still buttoned, though his tie had long been discarded on the floor. He stared at the balcony doors, replaying the last moments he remembered, turning them over again and again in his mind, like stones he hoped might eventually reveal something hidden beneath their surface. They had laughed together as they entered the suite. Alara had teased him about tripping over his own ceremonial sword during the vows, a small stumble that had made half the guests chuckle and the other half hold their breath in sympathy. He remembered pouring 2 glasses of wine from the bottle left chilling beside the bed, remembered her slipping off her shoes and stepping onto the balcony to look at the fireworks still glowing faintly in the distance over the harbor. He remembered turning to find a second bottle of wine tucked into a cabinet near the window, and when he turned back, she was no longer standing there. He had assumed, in that first foolish moment, that she had simply stepped further along the balcony, perhaps leaning over the far railing to watch the boats returning to harbor after the fireworks display. He had called her name, expecting her familiar laugh in return, the warm sound that had, over their 2 years of courtship, become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Instead, there was only the wind, and the torn veil caught upon the railing, and a silence so complete, it felt as though the entire tower had been swallowed by it. He tried to explain this to the guards, to his father, to anyone who would listen, but the more he spoke, the more his own words sounded impossible even to himself. How does a person vanish from a locked room in the space of a single breath? He had checked the door himself, twice, finding it bolted from the inside, exactly as he had left it. He had checked beneath the bed, inside the wardrobe, behind the heavy curtains, every hiding place a frightened mind could conjure, and found nothing but empty space, and the fading scent of her perfume still lingering in the air. Detective work in Varnholm rarely touched the royal family directly. Crimes within the palace, when they occurred at all, were handled quietly by trusted court officials who valued discretion over truth. Men and women who had spent their careers learning precisely which questions were safe to ask, and which were better left buried beneath layers of polite silence. But this was no small matter that could be tucked away behind closed doors. The disappearance of a new princess, on her wedding night, with blood upon her veil, was too large a fire to smother quietly, no matter how skilled the palace's usual handlers of scandal might be. King Alaric made the decision himself, against the advice of several of his closest advisers, chief among them a thin, sharp-faced man named Edwin Castellan, who served as the king's chief counselor on matters of succession and royal law. Castellan argued forcefully, in a private meeting held only hours after the disappearance, that the investigation should remain entirely within the palace's own trusted circle, warning that outside involvement risked exposing details the royal family might prefer to keep private, regardless of the cost to the search itself. "With respect, Your Majesty," Castellan said carefully, choosing his words as though each one had been weighed and measured beforehand. Bringing in an outsider invites exactly the kind of scrutiny this family has spent generations avoiding. Allow me to handle this quietly, through channels we can trust completely. King Alaric studied his counselor for a long moment before answering, his exhaustion and grief plainly visible beneath his composed exterior. "Edwin," he said finally, "my son's wife has vanished from a locked room on the night of her own wedding. I no longer have the luxury of caring what channels are comfortable. I want the truth, whatever it costs this family to uncover it." Castellan bowed his head in reluctant acceptance, though something in his expression, a brief flicker of tension around his eyes, suggested his objection ran deeper than simple concern for the family's privacy. Mira would later come to recognize that flicker for exactly what it was, though in these earliest hours, only the king himself noticed it at all, and even he dismissed it quickly, as nothing more than an old advisor's natural caution. The king would bring in an outside investigator, someone unconnected to the court, someone with no loyalty to any noble family, someone who could look at the palace with fresh eyes and see what those inside it, blinded by tradition and fear, could not. Her name was Mira Solheim, a detective known throughout the kingdom for solving cases that others considered impossible. She had built her reputation, not through royal favor, but through quiet, careful work, cases involving missing merchants, hidden inheritances, and crimes tangled in webs of lies that had defeated more experienced investigators before her. She did not care for titles. She cared only for truth, a trait that had earned her both admiration and a healthy number of enemies among the capital's wealthier, more image-conscious families over the years. When the royal messenger arrived at her modest office near the harbor district, breathless from the urgency of his errand, Mira did not immediately agree to take the case. She listened carefully as the messenger described the disappearance, the locked room, the blood-stained veil, the frightened whispers already spreading through the city like smoke through dry timber. She asked only one question before accepting. Was the veil examined before it was moved? The messenger admitted it had been touched by several hands before anyone thought to preserve it properly, passed from a frightened maid to a guard captain to the royal physician himself, before finally reaching a drawer in the king's study. Mira sighed, already anticipating the difficulties ahead, the contaminated evidence, the trampled crime scene, the dozens of frightened witnesses whose memories would already be shifting and blurring under the weight of shock and fear. But she agreed nonetheless. Some mysteries, she believed, called out to be solved, no matter how tangled the threads had already become before she arrived to begin pulling at them. She arrived at the palace within hours, dressed plainly, carrying only a small leather satchel of tools and a notebook worn soft from years of use, its pages filled with the careful handwriting of a woman who trusted evidence far more than she trusted assumptions. The guards eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion as she was led through the grand halls toward the East Tower, where the disappearance had occurred, several of them exchanging glances that suggested they had expected someone considerably more impressive, or perhaps considerably more intimidating, than the calm, unassuming woman now walking briskly among them. Queen Isolde met her at the entrance to the suite, her expression cool and composed despite the chaos surrounding them. She studied Mira from head to toe before speaking, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to controlling every room she entered. "I hope you understand the sensitivity of this matter," the Queen said. "This is not simply an investigation. It is the future of this kingdom." Mira met her gaze evenly, refusing to be unsettled by the weight the Queen so clearly intended her words to carry. "I understand it is a young woman who is missing," she replied. "That is where my attention begins and ends. Everything else, Your Majesty, is simply context I will consider as it becomes relevant." The Queen's jaw tightened slightly, though she said nothing further, only stepping aside to allow Mira entry into the suite, her eyes following the detective's every movement, with a scrutiny that felt, to Mira, considerably more watchful than simple maternal concern for a missing daughter-in-law would typically require. Inside, the room remained largely undisturbed since the discovery, aside from the movement of the veil itself. Mira moved slowly, taking in every detail with the patient thoroughness that had made her career. The overturned wine glasses, one shattered against the floor, the other resting undisturbed upon the side table. The single shoe left near the bed, its pair nowhere to be found. The balcony doors, slightly ajar, their curtains still fluttering gently in the morning breeze, carrying with them the faint, briny scent of the sea beyond the palace walls. She stepped onto the balcony, studying the stone railing where the veil had been found. The break in the railing was old, worn down by years of weather rather than any recent force, a detail the earlier searchers had apparently overlooked entirely in their panic. She knelt, examining the floor closely, and noticed something the guards had overlooked in their haste. A single set of scuff marks leading not toward the edge of the balcony, as though someone had fallen or been thrown, but toward the side, toward a narrow drainage pipe that ran down the side of the tower, half hidden behind a thick curtain of climbing ivy that had grown wild and untended over the years. It was a detail so small it might have gone unnoticed entirely, yet to Mira, it changed everything. This was not the scene of a struggle that ended in someone falling or being taken by force. This was the scene of someone who had planned an escape, someone who had known this drainage pipe existed, and had trusted it enough to use it as a means of leaving the tower unseen. She said nothing of her theory yet, choosing instead to continue her examination in silence, aware that premature conclusions, spoken too soon, had a way of hardening into assumptions that blinded investigators to evidence still waiting to be discovered. She interviewed the guards stationed near the tower that night, each of whom insisted they had seen nothing unusual until the maid's scream, though one younger guard, barely more than a boy, admitted quietly that he had briefly left his post near midnight to relieve himself, a confession he clearly feared might cost him his position entirely. She interviewed the kitchen staff, the stable hands, even the musicians who had played long into the evening, exhausted men and women still wearing the remnants of their formal wedding attire, their eyes heavy with lack of sleep and worry. Each interview added small fragments to a picture, still far from complete. But one detail stood out above the rest. Nearly every servant she spoke with mentioned, almost in passing, that Princess Alara had seemed distracted throughout the wedding day, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, her attention drifting toward the garden gate more than once during the ceremony itself, as though some part of her mind remained fixed on a thought she could not fully release. Mira wrote this down carefully in her notebook, underlining it twice, and beside it, in smaller letters, wrote a single word that would guide the remainder of her investigation: why. By evening, exhausted but far from finished, she requested a private audience with Prince Damien himself. He agreed immediately, eager for any progress, however small, his desperation plain in the way his hands trembled slightly as he gestured for her to sit. He led her not to the honeymoon suite, but to a smaller sitting room down the corridor, one that felt less like a crime scene and more like a place where two people could speak honestly, away from the watchful eyes still lingering throughout the rest of the palace. "Tell me about her," Mira said simply, settling into a chair across from him. "Not the princess the kingdom saw, the woman you knew." Damien hesitated, his hands twisting together in his lap, and for a long moment, Mira wondered if he might refuse to answer at all, overwhelmed as he clearly was by grief and fear in equal measure. But slowly, gently, memories began finding their way into words. "She was kind," he said finally, "kinder than anyone expected a future queen to be. She used to sneak food to the stable hands during winter, when the kitchen staff thought no one was watching. She hated formal dinners, always found some excuse to escape them early, usually claiming a headache that never seemed to trouble her once she reached the gardens. She loved the sea. She used to say that no matter how grand this palace was, it always felt smaller to her than a single afternoon spent walking along an open shore." He paused, his voice growing quieter, the memory clearly costing him something to speak aloud. But these past few weeks, she had changed. She grew quiet, distracted. I asked her what troubled her, and she always said it was nothing, only wedding nerves. I believed her, because I wanted to, because believing anything else felt too frightening to consider. Mira studied him carefully, watching not just his words but the small, involuntary movements that often revealed more than speech ever could. The way his eyes drifted toward the window whenever he mentioned Ilara's growing distance, as though some part of him already suspected the answer lay somewhere beyond these walls. Did she ever mention anyone new in her life? A friend, perhaps? Someone from outside the palace? Damien's brow furrowed in thought, his mind clearly working backward through the weeks leading up to the wedding, searching for a detail that might have seemed insignificant at the time. "There was a woman," he said slowly. "A seamstress, I believe, who came to fit her wedding gown. Ilara seemed to know her already, before the fittings began, though I never questioned it closely. They spoke quietly sometimes, in a way that felt private, though I never asked what about. I assumed it was simply wedding preparations, the kind of conversation brides share about lace and fittings and things I never understood well enough to ask about myself." Mira noted the detail carefully. "Do you know this seamstress's name?" Damien shook his head. "I never learned it. Ilara handled all the arrangements herself, said she wanted the process to remain a surprise, even from me. It was a small thread, thin and fragile, But Mira had learned long ago that even the smallest threads, followed carefully enough, could unravel the largest of mysteries. She thanked the prince for his honesty, and rose to leave, her mind already turning over the pieces she had gathered, arranging and rearranging them like a puzzle whose final image remained frustratingly out of reach. As she walked back through the palace halls, the weight of the case settled fully upon her shoulders. A missing princess, a blood-stained veil that told a story different from what everyone assumed, a mysterious seamstress who seemed to know the bride before their formal meeting, a queen mother whose composure felt less like grief and more like control, a counselor who had argued against outside investigation with an urgency that seemed, in hindsight, considerably out of proportion to simple concern for privacy. Something dark moved beneath the surface of this palace, hidden behind polished floors and painted smiles. Mira could feel it, the way a sailor feels a storm, long before the first cloud appears on the horizon, a subtle shift in the air that experienced instinct, recognized long before conscious thought could fully explain it. She passed a window overlooking the front courtyard on her way toward the guest chambers assigned to her for the duration of the investigation, and paused briefly, watching the small crowd of reporters still gathered beyond the palace gates despite the late hour. Among them, she noticed a young woman standing apart from the others, notebook in hand, watching the palace windows with an attentiveness that suggested she, too, understood the value of patience over noise. Mira made a mental note of her, uncertain yet whether this stranger might prove useful, or simply another complication, in an investigation already growing more tangled by the hour. Whatever had happened to Princess Alara on her wedding night, one truth was already becoming clear. This was no simple disappearance. This was the beginning of a secret, far larger than anyone within these walls was ready to admit, and Mira Solheim intended to find every piece of it, no matter how deep she had to dig, or how many powerful people stood in her way. The morning after her first day of investigation, Mira returned to the palace before sunrise, hoping to catch the household staff before their duties began, while their memories were still fresh and their guard still low. She found the palace already awake, though not with the usual rhythm of servants preparing breakfast trays and polishing silver. Instead, a tense silence hung over every hallway, broken only by hushed conversations that stopped the moment she came near, replaced by the careful, downcast eyes of people who had clearly been warned to say nothing to strangers. Word of the disappearance had spread beyond the palace walls overnight. Newspapers across the kingdom carried the story on their front pages, some sympathetic toward the grieving prince, others already hinting at darker theories involving the royal family itself. Mira had read 3 different papers on her way to the palace, each offering a different version of events, none of them close to what she suspected was the truth. One paper, written by the same sharp-eyed reporter she had noticed the previous evening, Priya Ashford, stood apart from the others in its careful, measured tone, refusing to speculate wildly, and instead simply laying out the confirmed facts with a precision that impressed Mira despite herself. She began her second day by seeking out the seamstress Damien had mentioned. The palace records kept careful account of every vendor who worked on the royal wedding, yet when Mira requested the seamstress's name and address, the head of household staff, a stern older woman named Greta, hesitated before answering, her eyes flicking briefly toward the corridor, as though checking whether anyone else might be listening. There was no formal seamstress hired through the palace for the princess's gown, Greta admitted eventually. The princess insisted on choosing her own dressmaker, someone from outside our usual circle. I never questioned it. Brides often have their preferences, and Princess Alara was gentle but firm whenever she wanted something handled her own way. Do you know where I might find this woman? Mira asked. Greta shook her head slowly. I only saw her twice, during the fittings. She kept to herself, spoke little, and left the moment her work was finished each time. I never learned her name. I remember thinking it strange, at the time, that the princess seemed almost protective of her, as though she did not wish the rest of us to grow too familiar with this particular guest. It was another dead end, though Mira refused to see it that way. Every closed door, in her experience, simply meant she needed to find a different way in. She spent the following hours speaking with the wedding planners, hoping one of them might recall a name or address connected to the mysterious dressmaker. Most had little information to offer, distracted as they were by the chaos following the disappearance, several of them clearly more concerned with whether they might face blame for some failure in the ceremony's arrangements. than with helping locate the missing bride. But one young assistant, eager to prove her usefulness and perhaps hoping to distinguish herself from her more anxious colleagues, remembered something the others had overlooked. The dressmaker arrived each time in a carriage marked with a small crest, she said. Not a noble crest, but a merchant's mark, from a shop near the harbor district. I remember because it matched the fabric shop where I once bought ribbon for my own sister's wedding. A lovely little place, tucked between a bakery and a shipping office, run by an older man with dye-stained hands. Mira thanked her warmly, grateful for the small but significant lead. The harbor district was familiar territory, not far from her own modest office. If the dressmaker could be found there, Mira intended to find her before the day's end. Before leaving the palace, however, she made a point of seeking out Edwin Castellan, curious to understand more clearly why the king's chief counselor had argued so strongly against her involvement in the first place. She found him in a small office lined floor to ceiling with legal volumes and ancient ledgers, his desk immaculately organized, not a single paper out of place. "Counselor Castellan," she said, offering a polite nod as she entered. "I wonder if I might ask you a few questions regarding the days leading up to the wedding." Castellan looked up from his work, his expression carefully neutral, though Mira noted the faint tightening around his eyes that seemed to accompany any mention of the investigation. "Of course," he said smoothly, "though I fear I know little that would prove useful. My work concerns matters of law and succession, not the personal affairs of the royal household." "Yet succession seems a fitting place to begin," Mira said, watching his reaction closely. "Can you tell me whether anything unusual has arisen recently concerning the line of succession? Any old records reviewed? Any questions raised about legitimacy or claim?" For the briefest moment, something flickered across Castellan's composed features, gone so quickly that a less attentive observer might have missed it entirely. "Nothing of the sort," he said, his voice perhaps a fraction too quick, too smooth. "Succession within this kingdom has remained settled and uncontested for generations. I cannot imagine what would prompt such a question." Mira thanked him and left without pressing further, aware that some doors were better tested gently, from a distance, rather than forced open too soon and slammed shut in response. She made a careful note in her book beside his name, a small mark that meant, in her private shorthand, "worth watching." She departed the palace shortly after midday, weaving through the crowded streets of Varnholm's capital, where merchants shouted their wares, and children darted between carts loaded with fresh fish and imported silks, the ordinary rhythms of city life continuing on, entirely unaware of the drama unfolding within the palace walls above them. The harbor district buzzed with its usual energy, gulls circling overhead, the salty tang of the sea mixing with the smell of fresh bread from a dozen small bakeries lining the winding streets. It took nearly 2 hours of careful searching before Mira found the fabric shop bearing the crest the young assistant had described. The shop was small, tucked between a bakery and a shipping office exactly as promised, its windows displaying bolts of fine cloth in deep blues and soft golds, catching the afternoon light in a way that made the entire storefront glow warmly against the gray stone buildings surrounding it. A bell rang softly as Mira stepped inside. An older man greeted her from behind the counter, his hands stained with the faint blue of dye long worked into his skin, his apron similarly marked with years of careful craftsmanship. Mira introduced herself carefully, choosing her words to avoid alarming him unnecessarily. "I'm looking for a woman who may have worked from this shop recently," she explained. "She would have been fitting a wedding gown for a client at the palace." The man's expression shifted immediately, a flicker of recognition crossing his weathered face, followed quickly by something that resembled quiet worry. "You mean Corinne," he said slowly. "She rented a small workroom from us for several weeks. Skilled hands, that one. Quiet though, kept to herself mostly, though she was kind enough whenever we spoke." "Is she here now?" Mira asked, her pulse quickening slightly. The man shook his head. "She left 3 days ago, paid what she owed and took her things without much explanation. Said she had urgent business elsewhere. I remember thinking it odd, given how close the wedding was, that she would leave her work unfinished so suddenly, though I suppose she must have completed the gown itself, since the princess wore it beautifully, from what I heard. 3 days before the wedding." Mira's mind raced through the implications of this timing, aligning perfectly with the growing distance Damien had described in Alara's behavior during those same final days. Do you know where she went? Any family? Any address she might have mentioned? The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, before finally answering. She mentioned once, in passing, that she had family near the coastal village of Bramholt. I don't know if that helps you, but it's the only thing I recall. She said her grandmother had lived there once, long ago, though she rarely spoke of her family at all, and I never pressed her for more than she offered freely. Mira thanked him and left the shop quickly, her thoughts already turning toward the journey to Bramholt, a small fishing village, nearly a full day's travel from the capital. It was a slim lead, but it was the strongest thread she had uncovered so far, and she intended to follow it, no matter how far it led. Before leaving the city, however, she returned once more to the palace, hoping to gather additional information from Prince Damien, whose memory of the days leading up to the wedding might hold further clues she had not yet uncovered. As she approached the palace gates, she noticed Priya Ashford still lingering nearby, though the reporter made no move to approach her directly, seemingly content to observe from a respectful distance, her notebook tucked beneath her arm. Mira found Damien in the palace gardens this time, seated alone on a stone bench beneath a wide oak tree, staring blankly at the fountain before him. He looked as though he had not slept at all since the disappearance, dark shadows carved beneath his eyes, his usually composed posture now slumped with exhaustion and worry, his fine wedding clothes finally exchanged for simple, practical attire that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. I found the dressmaker's shop, Mira said gently, sitting beside him. Her name is Corinne. She left the city 3 days before the wedding, without much explanation. Damien's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly sharp with attention, cutting through the exhaustion that had clouded them only moments before. 3 days before? He repeated. That's the same day Alara seemed most distant. I remember now. She left the palace that afternoon, saying she needed fresh air. She returned hours later, quieter than before, as though something had shaken her deeply, her eyes red-rimmed, as though she had been crying, though she insisted it was nothing when I asked. Do you know where she went during those hours? Mira asked. Damien shook his head slowly, clearly frustrated with himself. I never asked. I should have asked. I was so focused on the wedding preparations, on making certain everything would be perfect for her, that I never stopped to wonder why perfection seemed to matter so little to her in those final days. Mira placed a reassuring hand briefly on his arm. You could not have known what was coming, she said. None of us could have. Hindsight has a cruel way of making every missed question feel like a failure, when in truth, none of us can see danger clearly until it has already passed. She rose to leave, informing him of her plan to travel to Bramholt in search of further answers. Damien insisted on accompanying her, despite Mira's initial hesitation, his desperation to do something, anything, beyond waiting helplessly within the palace walls plainly evident in the urgency of his request. Eventually, they agreed upon a compromise. Damien would travel in simple, unmarked clothing, accompanied only by a single trusted guard, while Mira led the journey under the guise of ordinary travelers, rather than a royal search party, avoiding the attention that a prince's official departure would inevitably attract from both the public and, Mira privately suspected, from certain interested parties within the palace itself. They departed the following morning, before the sun had fully risen over Varnholm's rooftops, slipping quietly through a side gate rarely used by anyone beyond the household staff. The journey to Bramholt wound through quiet forests and along the rugged coastline, the salty air growing stronger with each passing mile, gulls wheeling overhead against a pale morning sky streaked with the first golden light of dawn. Damien remained largely silent throughout much of the journey, his mind clearly consumed by thoughts of his missing bride, though occasionally he would ask Mira quiet questions about her methods, her past cases, the careful logic that guided her work. Questions Mira suspected were less about genuine curiosity and more about distracting himself from the fear gnawing steadily at his composure. As they approached the outskirts of the village, late in the afternoon, Mira noticed something that immediately caught her attention. A small cluster of fishing boats bobbed gently in the harbor, their sails marked with a symbol she recognized from her earlier research into old maritime trade routes, a symbol connected to a group of coastal families who had, generations ago, been closely tied to the royal court, before falling from favor under circumstances lost to history, circumstances she now suspected might prove considerably less lost than the official record suggested. Something about Bramholt felt significant beyond its role as a simple fishing village. Mira could sense it in the quiet, watchful eyes of the villagers who paused their work to observe the unfamiliar travelers entering their town. In the careful way conversations seemed to stop and start again as they passed by, as though the entire village had learned, long ago, the value of guarding its own secrets carefully from outsiders. They found modest lodging at a small inn near the village center, the innkeeper eyeing them with cautious curiosity, but asking few questions as they settled in for the evening, accepting Mira's coin without comment, and showing them to two simple rooms overlooking the harbor. Mira wasted no time beginning her inquiries, discreetly asking around about a woman named Corinne, who might have recently returned to the village, careful to phrase her questions casually, as though the matter carried little urgency. Aware that villagers accustomed to guarding their own quickly grew suspicious of outsiders who seemed too eager for answers. It took only a handful of careful questions before an elderly fisherman mending nets near the harbor offered the information she sought, his weathered hands never pausing in their work even as he spoke. "Corinne," he said, nodding slowly. "Lives up near the old lighthouse, past the northern cliffs. Been gone from the village for years, working in the capital, they say. Surprised to see her back so suddenly, though she keeps mostly to herself these days. Her family's always been a bit apart from the rest of us, if you understand my meaning. Kept to the old ways longer than most." "What old ways would those be?" Mira asked carefully. The fisherman shrugged, his expression closing slightly, as though he had already said more than he intended. "Family traditions," he said simply. "Nothing that concerns folks from the capital. Best you ask her yourself, if it's her business you're after." Mira thanked him, and returned to share the news with Damien, who had been waiting anxiously at the inn. Pacing the small room in a way that suggested stillness had become nearly impossible for him since the disappearance began. Together, they decided to approach the lighthouse the following morning, hoping the isolated location might offer answers no one in the village itself seemed willing to share. That evening, as they shared a quiet meal at the inn, Damien confided something he had not yet mentioned during the journey. "There's something else," he said slowly, staring down at his untouched plate. "A few weeks before the wedding, I found Ilara in the palace library late one night, surrounded by old records, genealogies mostly, family trees going back generations. When I asked what she was studying, she closed the books quickly and said only that she wanted to understand the family she was marrying into more fully. I thought nothing of it at the time. Brides often want to understand their new family's history, but now I wonder if she was searching for something specific." Mira leaned forward, her attention sharpening considerably. "Do you remember which records, specifically?" Damien shook his head slowly, frustration evident in his expression. "I only glimpsed the covers before she closed them. Old leather bindings, faded gold lettering I couldn't quite read in the candlelight. I never thought to ask more." It was another small piece, fitting alongside the others Mira had already gathered, though the full picture still remained frustratingly incomplete. She made a note to examine the palace library's older records more closely once they returned from Bramholt, curious what genealogies Ilara might have found so compelling that she felt compelled to hide her research even from her own betrothed. That night, as Mira reviewed her notes by candlelight in the small inn room, she felt sleep pulling at her despite the urgency of the case, the long day's travel finally catching up with her exhausted mind. She allowed herself only a few hours of rest before rising well before dawn, eager to reach the lighthouse before the village fully woke, and word of their inquiries could spread ahead of them. The lighthouse stood at the very edge of the northern cliffs, its white paint faded by years of salt wind, its lantern room, dark though the structure still appeared carefully maintained, the surrounding grounds neatly kept despite the isolation of the location. Mira and Damien climbed the narrow path leading toward it just as the sun began to break over the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky ground beneath their feet, the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below providing a steady, rhythmic backdrop to their careful ascent. A thin line of smoke rose from a chimney, attached to a small cottage beside the lighthouse itself, suggesting someone was indeed home, despite the early hour. Mira signaled for Damien to remain a short distance behind, concerned that his presence might startle whoever waited inside before they had a chance to speak freely, his royal bearing difficult to fully disguise even in simple traveling clothes. She approached the cottage door and knocked firmly, listening as footsteps shuffled slowly from within. The door opened only partway, revealing a woman in her middle years, her dark hair streaked with early gray. Her eyes immediately guarded the moment she saw an unfamiliar visitor standing before her hand tightening visibly on the edge of the doorframe. "Corinne," Mira said gently, keeping her tone calm and non-threatening. "My name is Mira Solheim. I've been asked to help find Princess Alara. I believe you may know something about what happened to her." The woman's face paled instantly, her hand tightening further on the edge of the door, as though she might close it at any moment, her eyes darting nervously past Mira, toward the path beyond. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, her voice unsteady despite her attempt at composure. Mira held her ground patiently, her voice remaining calm and measured, despite the tension crackling in the air between them. "I know you fitted her wedding gown," she continued. "I know you left the capital 3 days before the ceremony, the same day Alara returned to the palace distracted and troubled. I know you have family ties along this coast, connected to people who once served this kingdom in ways that have since been forgotten. I am not here to cause you harm, Corinne. I am here because a young woman's life may depend on the truth you're hiding." For a long moment, Corinne said nothing, her eyes darting nervously toward the path behind Mira, where Damien now stood visible in the growing morning light, his simple traveling cloak doing little to disguise the bearing of someone raised within palace walls. Recognition flickered across her face the instant she saw him, confirming beyond doubt that she indeed knew far more than she had initially admitted, her shoulders sagging slightly, as though some invisible weight had finally, inevitably, settled fully upon her. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped back from the doorway, allowing them both entry into the small, warmly lit cottage, glancing once more toward the empty path outside, before closing the door firmly behind them. Inside, the space was simple but comfortable, filled with the quiet clutter of a life lived alone. Shelves lined with books and small carved figures of ships and seabirds, a single faded portrait of an older woman hanging above the hearth, her stern expression softened somewhat by the warm afternoon light filtering through the nearby window. Corinne gestured toward 2 chairs near the modest hearth, before settling herself across from them, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though bracing herself for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Please," Mira said softly, "tell us what you know." Corinne closed her eyes briefly before beginning, her voice trembling slightly as the words finally came, years of carefully guarded silence clearly costing her considerable effort to finally set aside. "It started months ago," she said. "Alara came to my shop not for a fitting, but because she recognized something in an old piece of fabric I kept displayed, a pattern unique to families along this coast, woven in a style my grandmother taught me, passed down through generations of our family alone. She asked where it came from, and I made the mistake of telling her the truth." "What truth?" Damien asked, unable to remain silent any longer, his voice tight with barely restrained urgency, leaning forward in his chair, as though he might close the remaining distance between them through sheer force of will. Corinne looked at him directly for the first time, her expression softening slightly with something that resembled sympathy, perhaps recognizing in his desperation an echo of her own fear over the years. "Your bride discovered, quite by accident, a secret buried deep within the history of the royal family," she explained. "A secret involving an heir born generations ago, outside the recognized royal line, a child whose existence was hidden to protect the succession as it stands today." Mira leaned forward slightly, her interest sharpening considerably, the fragments of Damien's mention of old genealogies finally clicking neatly into place alongside this new revelation. "And this secret connects to your family?" Corinne nodded slowly. "My grandmother was the woman entrusted with raising that hidden child," she said. "Our family has carried the knowledge, and the burden, ever since, quietly, without ever revealing it to anyone outside our own bloodline. We were sworn, generations ago, to guard this secret with our silence. In exchange for the quiet protection and modest support the royal family has always discreetly provided in return. When Alara began asking questions, I feared what might happen if the truth ever reached the wrong ears within the palace, and I feared even more what might happen to my own family if word spread that I had been the one to break our long-standing silence." Damien's face had grown increasingly pale throughout the explanation, his mind clearly struggling to process the weight of what he was hearing, his hands gripping the arms of his chair tightly enough that his knuckles had turned white. "Why would this matter now?" he asked quietly. That was generations ago. Why would it threaten Alara? Corinne's expression grew grave. Because the current line of succession depends entirely on the assumption that no other legitimate heir exists, she said. If proof of this hidden bloodline ever surfaced, publicly, undeniably, it could challenge everything. Your father's claim to the throne, your own future as king. There are those within the palace who would do anything to ensure such proof never comes to light, and I fear Alara's questions may have reached ears far more dangerous than either of us anticipated. Mira's mind raced through the implications of this revelation, thoughts of Edwin Castellan's evasive answer, and visible tension surfacing immediately. Are you suggesting Alara's disappearance is connected to this secret, that someone within the palace silenced her to protect the throne? Corinne hesitated, choosing her next words with visible care. I believe Alara discovered enough to become dangerous to certain people, she said slowly. When she came to me 3 days before the wedding, she was frightened, more frightened than I had ever seen her. She told me she planned to confront someone with what she had learned, though she never told me who. She said she needed to know the truth before she could marry into a family built upon secrets she did not fully understand. And after that conversation? Mira pressed gently. I never saw her again, Corinne admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I left the capital that same night, fearing my own involvement might be discovered. I have been hiding here ever since, praying I made the right decision in leaving when I did, and praying even harder that whatever she confronted did not cost her the safety she deserved. The room fell into heavy silence as the full weight of Corinne's confession settled over them, the crackling fire, providing the only sound beyond the distant, endless rhythm of waves against the cliffs outside. Damien sat rigid in his chair, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his mind clearly working through a devastating new possibility, that his own family, the people he had trusted his entire life, might bear some responsibility for his bride's disappearance. Mira, meanwhile, felt the final pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to align. The blood-stained veil that seemed staged rather than the result of violence, the scuff marks leading toward an escape route rather than a struggle, Alara's growing distance in the days before her wedding, her secretive research among the palace's old genealogies, all of it now pointed toward a single, unsettling possibility. Princess Alara had not been taken against her will that night. She had chosen to disappear, deliberately, carefully, likely fearing for her own safety, after uncovering a secret, dangerous enough to threaten the very foundation of the kingdom's ruling family. But if that were true, where had she gone? And who, precisely, within the palace walls, might have driven her to such a desperate decision? Mira turned back toward Corinne, her voice steady, despite the storm of questions racing through her mind. Did Alara ever mention anyone specific she suspected? She asked carefully. Anyone within the palace she believed might be dangerous? Corinne shook her head slowly. She never gave me a name, she said, but she did say something I've never forgotten. She said the danger was closer to the throne than anyone would ever suspect. Someone who smiled warmly in public while guarding secrets far darker underneath. The words hung heavily in the small cottage, their implications settling over all three of them like a shadow. Mira thought immediately of Queen Isolde, whose composed exterior had struck her as unsettling from their very first meeting, whose reaction to her son's missing bride had felt more calculated than genuinely grieving. But she thought too of Edwin Castellan, whose careful, practiced denial regarding matters of succession had felt equally rehearsed, equally suspicious. She said nothing of these suspicions aloud, unwilling to accuse anyone without solid proof, yet the thought lingered persistently as she thanked Corinne for her honesty and rose to leave the cottage. Damien followed silently behind her, his expression hollow with the weight of everything he had just learned. Before they departed, Corinne caught Mira's arm gently at the doorway, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. Please, she said, whatever you find, be careful who you trust within those walls. My grandmother always said, the most dangerous secrets are guarded by the people who smile the widest while keeping them. As they made their way back down the cliffside path toward the village, the sea stretching wide and restless beside them, Mira understood clearly that their investigation had shifted dramatically in direction. This was no longer simply a search for a missing bride. This was now a search for the truth behind a secret powerful enough to threaten a kingdom's throne, a secret that Princess Ilara herself may have been forced to disappear in order to survive. And somewhere within the palace they had left behind, someone was watching their return, with far greater interest than either of them yet realized. The journey back to the capital felt far longer than the ride out to Bramholt had been, though the distance remained exactly the same. Damien said little throughout the trip, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside without truly seeing it, his thoughts clearly consumed by the revelation Corinne had shared. Mira allowed him his silence, understanding that some truths required time to settle before a person could speak of them freely, though she used the long hours of travel to begin sketching out, carefully in her notebook, the possible connections between everything they had learned so far. They arrived back at the palace as evening fell, the great halls glowing with candlelight that felt, to Mira, far less welcoming than it had before. She excused herself quickly, eager to review her notes and consider carefully how to proceed with such a delicate and dangerous piece of information now in her possession. Accusing a member of the royal family, particularly one as powerful and composed as Queen Isolde, required more than suspicion. It required undeniable proof Mira did not yet possess. Before retiring for the night, however, she made a point of stopping by the palace library, curious to examine the genealogical records Damien had mentioned Ilara studying in the weeks before her disappearance. The library itself stretched across 2 full floors of the palace's oldest wing, shelves rising high into shadowed rafters, the air thick with the particular scent of aging paper and leather bindings that had accumulated over centuries. A young librarian, still working late despite the hour, offered to assist her once Mira explained, carefully, the nature of her inquiry. "I remember the princess spending time here," the librarian admitted, leading Mira toward a section devoted to family records and royal histories. "She asked me once about records concerning children born outside recognized marriages, said it was simply idle curiosity about old customs. I thought nothing of it at the time, though I do remember she seemed particularly interested in records from roughly a century and a half ago." Mira thanked the young man, and spent nearly an hour combing carefully through the section he indicated, though the sheer volume of material made a thorough search impossible in a single evening. She did note, however, that several volumes appeared to have been recently disturbed, their spines cracked in ways that suggested frequent, careful handling, dust patterns disrupted in places that matched no obvious pattern of routine maintenance. She spent that night in a small guest chamber offered to her within the palace, poring over every detail she had gathered since the investigation began, searching for any thread that might connect the Queen, or Castellan, or anyone else within these walls, directly to Ilara's disappearance. She thought carefully about the timeline of events, Ilara's growing fear and distraction in the weeks leading up to her wedding, her final, frightened visit to the dressmaker 3 days before the ceremony, her apparent decision to confront someone with what she had discovered. The following morning, she requested a private meeting with several members of the palace staff, who had worked closely with the Queen over the years, hoping their observations might reveal details the Queen herself had carefully concealed. Most offered little beyond generic praise for their employer's composure and dedication to the kingdom, though Mira noted carefully which servants seemed most reluctant to speak at all, aware that fear, more than loyalty, often explained the deepest silences. One elderly attendant, a woman named Ottilie who had served the royal family for over 3 decades, hesitated noticeably when Mira asked about the days immediately preceding the wedding, her hands twisting nervously in her apron as she considered how to answer. "Is there something you wish to share?" Mira asked gently, sensing the woman's reluctance. Ottilie glanced nervously toward the door before lowering her voice, as though even these walls, familiar to her after 30 years of service, might somehow betray her words to unwelcome ears. "The night before the wedding," she admitted, "I overheard raised voices coming from the Queen's private study, quite late in the evening. I did not recognize both voices clearly, but I believe one belonged to the princess." Mira's pulse quickened. "Did you hear what was said?" Ottilie shook her head slowly. "Only fragments," she admitted. "I heard the princess say something about proof, about truth the kingdom deserved to know, and I heard the Queen respond, quite sharply, that some truths were better left buried, for the good of everyone involved. There was mention, too, of a name, though I could not make it out clearly through the closed door. Something that sounded like a place, or perhaps a person, I truly cannot be certain which." "Try to remember," Mira urged gently. "Even a fragment might help." Ottilie closed her eyes, concentrating hard, before finally shaking her head with evident frustration. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's gone. I wish I could offer you more." It was not concrete proof, not yet, but it was enough to confirm Mira's growing suspicion that a direct confrontation had indeed taken place between Alara and the Queen, mere hours before the wedding itself. Whatever had been said in that private study had clearly done nothing to resolve the danger Alara faced. If anything, it may have accelerated it. Mira thanked Ottilie for her honesty, assuring her the information would be handled with the utmost discretion. She then turned her attention toward gathering any physical evidence that might further support this timeline, evidence strong enough to justify a direct confrontation with the Queen herself. She returned to the honeymoon suite once more, examining the space with fresh eyes now that she understood the broader context surrounding Alara's disappearance. If Alara had indeed planned her own escape that night, rather than being taken by force, she would have required assistance, someone within the palace, capable of helping her slip away undetected, someone who understood the layout of the tower well enough to identify the drainage pipe as a viable, if dangerous, escape route. Mira thought immediately of the missing guard whose blood, according to the forensic examination, had actually stained the veil, rather than Alara's own. If the princess had needed help executing such a risky escape, a guard sympathetic to her situation, or perhaps someone she trusted deeply, would have been essential to the plan's success. She requested the full personnel records for every guard stationed near the East Tower on the night of the wedding, cross-referencing their assignments against the timeline she had carefully constructed. One name stood out immediately among the records, a young guard named Elias Farrow, whose scheduled shift ended precisely 1 hour before the disappearance was discovered, and who had not reported for duty since that night. Elias Farrow. The name meant nothing to Mira initially, until she recalled a detail from her very first day investigating the case. A passing mention from one of the stable hands about a guard who had grown unusually close to the princess in the weeks following her arrival at the palace. Someone who had, on more than one occasion, been seen speaking quietly with her during her early morning walks through the gardens, their conversations lasting considerably longer than simple courtesy between royalty and staff would typically require. She sought out the stable hand again, a wiry young man named Callum, to press for further detail. He seemed nervous discussing the matter, glancing repeatedly toward the palace, as though worried about being overheard. They spoke often, he admitted eventually. Elias and the princess. Nothing improper, mind you. Nothing anyone could call scandalous. But she trusted him. That much was plain. I remember once she mentioned, he reminded her of someone from her childhood, though she never said who. Could Elias Farrow have been the trusted companion who helped orchestrate Alara's escape? And if so, where might he have taken her? And why had neither of them attempted to make contact since that night? Especially now that Corinne's revelations suggested the danger they fled from was very real. Mira brought her findings to Damien later that afternoon, finding him once more in the gardens, though this time pacing restlessly rather than sitting in still, exhausted silence. She watched carefully, as his expression shifted from confusion to something closer to painful realization, as she laid out what she had discovered. "I remember him," Damien said slowly. "Elias. He was assigned to the East Tower only recently, transferred from a smaller post near the northern border. Alara mentioned him once, in passing, said he reminded her of someone from her childhood, someone she trusted instinctively. I never thought much of it. There are dozens of guards throughout the palace. I had no reason to suspect any particular one held her confidence. If they escaped together," Mira said carefully, "they would need somewhere safe to hide, somewhere far enough from the capital to avoid detection, yet familiar enough to offer genuine safety." Damien's eyes widened suddenly with a flash of memory, his pacing halting abruptly. "Alara used to speak of a village along the southern coast," he said, "a place her family visited when she was young, before her parents passed. She always spoke of it fondly, said it felt more like home than the palace ever had. She mentioned once that if she ever needed to disappear from the world entirely, that was where she would go." "Do you remember the name of this village?" Mira asked urgently. Damien nodded slowly, the memory clearly solidifying in his mind. "Halden Cove," he said. "It's a small fishing village, similar to Bramholt, though considerably farther south along the coast." Mira felt the pieces of the mystery clicking firmly into place, the picture growing clearer with each new detail uncovered. Ilara, frightened by what she had learned, and further endangered by her confrontation with the queen, had likely fled the palace with the help of a trusted guard, seeking refuge in a place from her childhood, where she believed she might find safety and time to determine her next course of action. But time, Mira understood clearly, was not on their side. If Queen Isolde had indeed viewed Ilara as a genuine threat to the kingdom's stability, it was entirely possible that Ilara and Elias were not the only ones searching for safety. Someone else, someone with considerably more resources and reach than a young detective and a heartbroken prince, might already be searching for them as well, intent on ensuring the dangerous truth Ilara carried never saw the light of day. That evening, as Mira prepared her plans for the journey south, a folded note was slipped quietly beneath her guest chamber door, unsigned, the handwriting hurried and unfamiliar. She unfolded it carefully by candlelight, her breath catching as she read the brief message written within. Trust no one who claims to protect the throne. Some protect only themselves. Halden Cove is watched. Move quickly, and move quietly. Mira stared at the note for a long moment, turning it over carefully, searching for any clue as to its author, before finally tucking it safely into her satchel alongside her other notes. Whoever had sent it clearly knew more than they were willing to reveal openly, yet its warning only confirmed what she already suspected. Time was running short, and danger, in some form, was already moving toward Halden Cove alongside them. There was no time to waste. Mira began preparations immediately for the journey south, determined to reach Ilara before anyone else could, before the kingdom's carefully guarded secret claimed another life in its desperate bid to remain buried forever. Halden Cove sat nestled between two rocky headlands, its harbor sheltered from the worst of the ocean's temper, its narrow streets lined with weathered cottages that had clearly stood for generations. Mira and Damien, accompanied this time by a single trusted guard named Osric who had served Damien personally since childhood, arrived just as evening settled over the village, the sky painted in soft shades of orange and purple that reflected gently across the calm harbor waters. Traveling this far south had taken longer than either of them anticipated, delayed further by Damien's insistence on maintaining careful secrecy, avoiding the main roads where royal patrols might recognize him despite his simple traveling clothes. Mira understood his caution, though the warning note still weighed heavily on her mind, its unsigned message repeating itself uneasily in her thoughts throughout the journey. She had shared its contents with Damien and Osric before their departure, and all three had agreed to proceed with heightened caution, watching carefully for any sign that their approach to the village had already been anticipated by unfriendly eyes. They began their search discreetly, avoiding direct questions about the royal family or the recent scandal that continued dominating headlines throughout the kingdom. Instead, Mira posed as a traveling merchant searching for a childhood friend, describing Ilara's general appearance without mentioning her true identity, hoping the villagers' natural discretion toward outsiders would work in their favor rather than against them. As they settled into the village's only inn, Mira noticed something that immediately sharpened her already heightened caution. Two men, strangers to the village by the innkeeper's own careless remark, had arrived only a day earlier, asking similarly vague questions about newcomers to the area, though their manner, according to the innkeeper's quiet complaint, had been far less polite than Mira's own careful approach. Rough sort, the innkeeper muttered, setting down bowls of stew before them. Asked about strangers in the area, offered coin for information, didn't much care for questions in return. I told them nothing, mind you. Don't care for that sort of business in my establishment. Mira exchanged a careful glance with Damien, both of them understanding immediately the implications of this news. Whoever had sent the warning note had been correct. Someone else was indeed searching for Ilara, and they had arrived in Halden Cove before Mira and Damien themselves, meaning every hour now carried considerably greater risk than before. Their efforts yielded little throughout the first evening, the villagers even more guarded than usual following the unwelcome visit from the two strangers, either genuinely unaware of any newcomers matching Ilara's description, or simply unwilling to share information with any unfamiliar visitors at all, regardless of how politely those questions were phrased. Mira sensed real fear beneath the village's usual reserve now, a fear she understood only added further urgency to their search. It was not until the following morning, while sharing a quiet breakfast at the village's only inn, that a young woman, clearing nearby tables, paused briefly. Her eyes flickering with something that resembled recognition when Mira mentioned, almost offhandedly, a friend with hair the color of autumn wheat and a gentle laugh that carried further than she probably realized. The young woman said nothing immediately, continuing her work as though she had not heard the comment at all. But later, as Mira and Damien prepared to leave the inn, she approached their table quietly, glancing nervously toward the kitchen, before speaking in a hushed voice, her eyes darting once toward the window, as though checking the street outside for the two rough strangers the innkeeper had mentioned. "You're looking for someone," she said, more statement than question. Mira nodded carefully. "A friend," she confirmed. "It's important that I find her, and important that I find her before anyone else does." The young woman's eyes widened slightly at this, understanding clearly passing between them. "There's two men been asking after her too," she said quietly. "Rougher than you. I didn't tell them anything. Didn't like the look of them at all." "That's very wise of you," Mira said gently. "And very brave." The young woman hesitated a moment longer before finally continuing. "There's a woman staying at the old cottage near the eastern cliffs," she said. "Arrived about a week ago with a man, kept mostly to themselves. Doesn't talk much about where they came from. My mother's been bringing them food, since they don't come into the village often, especially not since those two strangers arrived asking questions." Mira's heart quickened. "Can you take us there?" The young woman glanced once more toward the kitchen before nodding slowly. "My shift ends within the hour," she said. "I'll show you the path, but I won't go further than that. Whatever business you have with them, it's not mine to be part of. And please, be careful. Those men, whoever they are, don't seem the sort to give up easily." True to her word, the young woman led them along a narrow coastal path nearly an hour later, glancing over her shoulder more than once, as though worried about being followed, pointing toward a small, weathered cottage perched near the edge of the eastern cliffs, before turning back toward the village, without another word. Mira and Damien continued alone, Osric trailing a short distance behind to watch their path, their pace quickening with each step, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Halfway along the path, Osric suddenly raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "Movement," he whispered, gesturing toward a rocky outcropping some distance below the cliff path, where two figures could be seen making their own careful way along a lower trail, clearly heading in the same general direction as the cottage ahead. Mira's stomach tightened with dread. The two strangers, or others like them, had apparently narrowed their search to the same isolated stretch of coastline. "We need to move faster," Mira whispered urgently, and quietly. "If they reach the cottage before us, or worse, if they've already located it themselves and are simply waiting for the right moment, everything could be lost." They quickened their pace considerably, moving as swiftly and silently as the rugged terrain allowed, Damien's breath coming in tight, anxious gasps, as fear for Alara's safety drove him forward with an urgency that made caution increasingly difficult to maintain. As they approached the cottage, the door opened suddenly, before they could even announce their presence, revealing a young man standing cautiously in the doorway, his hand resting instinctively near a blade at his side, his eyes scanning the surrounding path with the practiced alertness of someone who had spent every day since his arrival, watching carefully, for exactly this kind of danger. Mira recognized him immediately from the description she had gathered, Elias Pharaoh, though he appeared thinner than his palace records suggested, his eyes carrying the exhausted wariness of someone who had spent every day since his arrival watching carefully for danger. His eyes widened in shock the moment he recognized Damien standing beside Mira, his hand tightening briefly on the hilt of his blade, before slowly relaxing. "Your Highness," he said quietly, his voice carrying a complicated mixture of relief and fear. "You shouldn't be here. It isn't safe." "We know," Damien said quickly. "There are men following us, or perhaps following you. We saw them on the lower path." Elias's expression darkened immediately, his hand returning firmly to his blade. "Inside," he said urgently, ushering them quickly through the doorway. "Now." "Where is she?" Damien asked immediately, as they crossed the threshold, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. Before Elias could answer, a familiar voice called softly from within the cottage, a voice that made Damien's entire body go still with disbelief. "Damien?" Alara stepped into the doorway beside Elias, her appearance dramatically different from the radiant bride who had walked down the aisle only weeks earlier. Her golden hair, once carefully styled for her wedding, now hung loose and simple around her shoulders. Her fine wedding attire had been replaced with simple traveling clothes, practical and unadorned. Yet her eyes, when they met Damien's, still held the same warmth and depth he remembered so clearly, though now shadowed, with an exhaustion and wariness that had not been there before. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply staring at one another across the short distance separating them, the weight of everything that had happened since their wedding night hanging heavily in the salty coastal air. But the moment could not last long. Elias's voice cut sharply through the emotional reunion, urgent and clipped. "Your Highness," he said, "I hate to interrupt, but we truly do not have time for this. If men are searching the lower path, we need to move now, before they circle back toward this cottage." Alara's expression shifted instantly from emotional relief to focused determination. Years of quiet strength evidently forged during her weeks in hiding. "He's right," she said. "There's a small boat moored below the cliffs. Elias's contingency should the cottage ever be discovered. We should move there now and decide our next steps from somewhere safer." Mira nodded firmly, recognizing the wisdom in prioritizing safety over emotional reunion in this critical moment. "Lead the way," she said. "We'll explain everything once we're certain we're no longer being followed." The group moved quickly and quietly along a narrow, little-used path, leading down toward a small, hidden inlet below the cottage. Elias leading the way with the confident familiarity of someone who had scouted this exact route many times over the preceding week, precisely in anticipation of a moment like this one. Osric brought up the rear, watching their trail carefully for any sign of pursuit, his hand resting ready near his own weapon throughout their careful descent. They reached the small boat without incident, tucked carefully into a hidden cove, invisible from the main coastal path above, and pushed off quietly into the calm morning waters, putting careful distance between themselves and the cottage, before any pursuers could possibly locate it. Only once they had rowed a considerable distance along the coastline, tucking finally into a second, even more secluded inlet, surrounded by high rocky walls, did Elias finally allow himself to relax slightly, lowering the oars and turning to face the group properly, for the first time since their hurried departure. "Now," he said, his breath still slightly uneven from the exertion, "we can talk." Settled now within the small boat, rocking gently against the sheltered walls of the hidden inlet, Elara began to explain, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of her words, everything that had happened since her final conversation with Corinne, 3 days before her wedding. "I confronted the Queen that same night," she admitted. "I told her what I had learned, about the hidden heir, about the truth she and the entire royal family had spent generations concealing. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that revealing this knowledge might somehow lead to a resolution, an honest reckoning with the past, rather than continued secrecy." "What did she say?" Damien asked quietly, though the answer already lived within Ottilie's fragmented account. He clearly wanted to hear it confirmed directly from Elara herself. Alara's expression darkened slightly at the memory. "She warned me, quite clearly, that pursuing this truth further would be a grave mistake," she said. "She made it clear that certain people within the palace would go to great lengths to ensure such information never became public, regardless of the personal cost involved. She mentioned a name too, though I did not fully understand its significance at the time. Castellan. She said if word of this ever reached him directly, matters would grow considerably more dangerous than either of us could control." Mira's suspicion sharpened immediately at this confirmation. "That aligns with what I observed myself," she said. Castellan argued strongly against bringing in outside investigation the moment this disappearance was discovered. His reaction to my questions about succession felt far too rehearsed for simple legal caution. Elara nodded slowly. "The Queen feared him, I believe, though she would never have admitted such a thing directly. I think she recognized that whatever protection she offered me by warning me away from the truth, it would mean little if Castellan learned of my discovery independently. That fear, more than any threat she made herself, is ultimately what convinced me I could not simply forget what I had learned and continue as though nothing had happened. I needed time, and safety, to determine how to handle such dangerous knowledge properly." Elias nodded, speaking for the first time since their arrival. "A minor injury of my own," he explained, gesturing to a faint scar still visible along the edge of his palm, sustained earlier that evening during preparations, before the ceremony itself began. "Elara and I finalized our plan only hours before the wedding. Once she returned from her confrontation with the Queen, convinced she could not proceed safely without first determining exactly how much danger she truly faced. We realized my earlier injury could serve a useful purpose in staging the scene convincingly, buying us time before anyone suspected the truth of what had actually happened. It was a clever plan, Mira acknowledged, though it left an entire kingdom searching desperately for answers, and left Damien believing something far more terrible had happened to you. Ilara's eyes filled with genuine remorse as she looked toward Damien. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I never wanted to cause you such pain. I simply didn't know who else I could trust within the palace walls. Not with something this dangerous. Not when even the Queen herself seemed frightened of what might happen if the truth spread too far, too quickly." Damien reached across the small space between them, taking her hand gently in his own, the boat rocking softly beneath them as the tide shifted. "You're safe now," he said firmly. "That's what matters most. But Ilara, we cannot hide here forever. Those men searching the lower path today prove that clearly enough. If Castellan, or anyone else, truly views this secret as dangerous enough to threaten your life, they will not stop searching until they find you." Mira leaned forward, her mind already working through the possibilities, aware that time had grown considerably shorter following the appearance of the two strangers near the cottage. "We need proof," she said firmly. "Concrete, undeniable proof of this hidden heir's existence. Proof strong enough to bring the truth into the open safely, on our own terms, rather than allowing it to remain a dangerous secret that continues to threaten your life indefinitely." "If such proof exists," Ilara said slowly, "it would likely be hidden somewhere within the palace itself, perhaps among old records the Queen has taken great care to keep hidden from public knowledge. I searched the library myself, before the wedding, but never found anything conclusive, only fragments and hints that suggested something significant lay buried somewhere within those older records, without ever revealing exactly what or where." "I noticed those same fragments myself," Mira said. "Disturbed volumes, evidence of frequent handling in a section devoted to old family records. There is likely an archive somewhere within the palace's older wings, one less frequently accessed by current staff, that might hold what we need." Elias spoke up again, his expression thoughtful. "There's an old archive beneath the eastern wing," he said. "I recall it from my training as a new guard, years ago. Rarely used, rarely even mentioned by senior staff. If proof exists anywhere within the palace, that seems the most likely place." The group fell into careful discussion, weighing the considerable risks of returning to the capital against the equally considerable danger of remaining hidden indefinitely while Castellan's men continued their search along the coast. Eventually, they reached a difficult but necessary decision. Returning to Varnholm, quietly and carefully, offered their best chance at finally resolving the danger threatening Ilara's life once and for all, rather than continuing to run from a threat that showed no sign of relenting. Osric, who had remained largely silent throughout the discussion, finally spoke, his voice carrying the practical weight of someone who had spent years thinking carefully about security and strategy. "If we return together, all at once, we risk considerable exposure," he said. "I suggest we split our approach. I will escort the princess and Elias back toward the capital through less traveled routes, while your highness and the detective proceed more directly, drawing any potential pursuit away from the princess's actual path." It was a sound plan, and after careful discussion, they agreed to proceed accordingly, splitting into two groups before nightfall, each taking a different route back toward the capital to minimize the risk of discovery. Before they parted ways, Ilara reached for Mira's hand, gripping it firmly. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing there was more to this than a simple, frightened bride running from her wedding. Not everyone would have looked as carefully as you did." Mira offered a small, reassuring smile in return. "The truth rarely announces itself loudly," she said. "It usually waits quietly, for someone patient enough to notice the smaller details everyone else overlooks. I simply did my job, though I confess this case has proven more complicated, and more important, than most I've handled before." As the two groups separated and began their careful, separate journeys back toward the capital, Mira found herself reflecting on how dramatically this investigation had evolved from its earliest hours, from a simple, terrifying disappearance within a locked tower room, to the uncovering of a secret buried across multiple generations, to a race now against powerful hidden enemies determined to ensure that secret remained buried at any cost, even the life of an innocent young woman who had done nothing more than seek an honest understanding of the family she was marrying into. The journey ahead promised to be considerably more dangerous than anything they had faced so far, but for the first time since the investigation began, Mira felt a clear, confident sense of the path forward, and she intended to see it through to its end. Whatever dangers still waited within the palace walls they were now racing to return to. Damien and Mira traveled through the night, taking a longer, more circuitous route toward the capital, in hopes of drawing away any pursuit that might otherwise focus on Alara's group. The road wound through dense forest for several hours, the moonlight filtering weakly through the thick canopy overhead, every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves sending a fresh jolt of tension through them both. It was nearing midnight when Osric's warning proved prophetic. A pair of riders emerged suddenly from a side path, blocking the road ahead, their faces obscured beneath dark hoods, though their posture carried the unmistakable readiness of men accustomed to confrontation. Mira's hand moved instinctively toward the small blade she carried, while Damien, despite his exhaustion, straightened immediately, years of formal training evident in the way his stance shifted to protect Mira's position beside him. "We're simply travelers," Mira said carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. "We want no trouble." The taller of the two riders laughed, low and humorless. "Strange," he said, his voice carrying a rough edge that matched the innkeeper's earlier description perfectly. "We've been asking after travelers matching your description for some time now. Seems trouble found you regardless." There was no time for further words. The second rider urged his horse forward suddenly, closing the distance between them with alarming speed. Damien moved quickly, pulling Mira back and putting himself between her and the approaching threat, his hand closing around the hilt of the simple sword he had carried, disguised beneath his traveling cloak, throughout their entire journey. What followed was a tense, chaotic exchange in the darkness, more scramble than skilled combat, as Damien fought to hold off the nearest rider, while Mira scrambled for the cover of the surrounding trees, her mind racing through every possible option available to them. She spotted, in the brief moments of struggle, a narrow gap in the forest undergrowth, just beyond the road, a path perhaps too narrow for the riders' horses to follow easily. "This way," she called urgently, and Damien, disengaging from his opponent with a final forceful shove, turned and sprinted toward her voice, both of them plunging into the dense undergrowth, as the riders shouted furiously behind them, their horses whinnying in frustration as the terrain grew too tangled for easy pursuit. They ran for what felt like an eternity, branches tearing at their clothes, roots threatening to trip them at every uneven step, until finally, breathless and exhausted, they collapsed against the base of a wide, ancient tree, listening carefully for any sound of continued pursuit. The forest remained silent around them, save for their own ragged breathing, and the distant, retreating sound of hooves, finally giving up the chase, along a road too narrow for further pursuit. "That was too close," Damien said finally, once his breathing had steadied enough to speak clearly. "If Castellan truly sent those men, he's grown considerably bolder than I ever imagined possible." Mira nodded grimly, examining a small cut along her arm where a branch had caught her during their desperate flight. Nothing serious enough to slow them further. "We cannot underestimate him again," she said firmly. "Whatever proof we find within that archive, we need to move quickly and carefully once we return, before he realizes we've slipped past him entirely." They continued their journey more cautiously after this encounter, avoiding the main roads entirely in favor of smaller, less traveled paths that added considerable time to their journey, but offered far greater safety from further ambush. By the time they finally glimpsed the distant towers of Varnholm's capital rising against the pale light of early morning, both were utterly exhausted, yet driven forward by the urgent knowledge that time, and safety, continued slipping away with each passing hour. They arrived back in Varnholm under cover of the early morning crowds, avoiding the main gates entirely in favor of a smaller entrance near the servants' quarters that Damien assured her would be far less closely watched during this busy hour, when the usual bustle of merchants and deliveries provided useful cover for their quiet return. Mira insisted on confirming, through a carefully worded message delivered by a trusted street contact, that Osric, Ilara, and Elias had likewise reached the capital safely, breathing a small sigh of relief when confirmation arrived within the hour that their group had taken shelter successfully at a discreet safe house near the harbor district, arranged through contacts Mira trusted implicitly from previous investigations. With Alara's safety confirmed, Mira and Damien proceeded directly into the palace to begin their search of the archive, understanding clearly now that every moment mattered considerably more than it had before their encounter on the forest road. The eastern wing felt eerily quiet as they made their way through its dimly lit corridors, the usual bustle of palace life absent at this late hour, though Mira found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, newly wary after the night's dangerous encounter. Damien led the way confidently, clearly familiar with passages that had likely gone unexplored by most residents of the palace for years, his exhaustion apparently forgotten entirely beneath the urgency of their mission. The archive itself lay behind a heavy wooden door, secured with a lock that appeared far older and simpler than the modern security measures found elsewhere throughout the palace. Damien produced a key from an old ring he had borrowed earlier from the palace steward, explaining quietly that few people even remembered this archive existed at all, let alone considered it worth securing more carefully. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with dusty ledgers, aging portraits, and stacks of documents bound with faded ribbon, decades of royal history stored away and largely forgotten. Mira lit a small lantern carefully, casting a soft glow across the room as they began their careful search, both of them working with a renewed sense of urgency, now that they understood clearly how dangerous the stakes had become. They worked methodically through the records, focusing particularly on documents dating back to the era Corinne had mentioned, when her grandmother had allegedly cared for a hidden royal heir. It was painstaking work, each ledger requiring careful examination, many written in formal language that made locating relevant information all the more challenging. The fading ink and archaic phrasing, testing even Mira's considerable patience. Nearly 2 hours into their search, Damien's fingers paused suddenly over a slim, leather-bound journal tucked between two much larger record books, its cover worn smooth with age. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the elegant handwriting filling its pages. "Mira," he said quietly, his voice tight with sudden tension, "I think I found something." Mira moved quickly to his side, reading over his shoulder, as he continued through the journal's contents. It appeared to be a personal diary, written by a woman identifying herself only by her first name, Margareta, detailing her experiences caring for a young child she referred to repeatedly as the Forgotten Prince, a child born to a member of the royal family outside the recognized line of succession, hidden away shortly after birth to protect the kingdom's political stability at the time. "This matches everything Corinne told us," Mira said softly, continuing to read carefully through the fragile pages. "If this journal can be authenticated, it could serve as exactly the kind of proof we need." As they continued searching the surrounding shelves, hoping to locate additional supporting documents, a sudden sound from the corridor outside made them both freeze instantly. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, approaching steadily toward the archive door. Mira quickly extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into darkness as she and Damien pressed themselves silently against the shelves nearest the door. The footsteps paused directly outside, followed by the sound of the heavy lock turning slowly, deliberately, as though whoever approached possessed their own key to this rarely used archive. The door swung open, revealing a single figure silhouetted against the dim corridor light beyond. Queen Isolde stepped into the archive, carrying her own small lantern, her expression unreadable as she moved directly toward the same section of shelving Mira and Damien had been searching only moments before. She paused abruptly, clearly noticing something amiss, perhaps the faint scent of their extinguished lantern still lingering in the air, or the slight disturbance among the carefully arranged documents. Her eyes narrowed sharply as she scanned the darkened room. "I know you're here," she said finally, her voice cutting sharply through the silence. "There's no point hiding any longer." Damien stepped forward first, unwilling to allow Mira to face his mother's anger alone. "Mother," he said steadily, his voice carrying more confidence than Mira had heard from him throughout their entire journey together. "We know the truth. We found Margaret's journal." Queen Isolde's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions, surprise, anger, and finally something that resembled genuine weariness, as though a burden she had carried alone for far too long had finally, unavoidably come to light. "You don't understand what you've uncovered," she said quietly, setting her lantern down carefully upon a nearby shelf. "This secret has protected this kingdom's stability for generations. Revealing it now could unravel everything your father and his father before him worked to build. Or it could finally allow the truth to be handled honestly, Damien countered firmly, rather than through fear and secrecy that nearly cost me the woman I love, and nearly cost Mira and myself our lives tonight, on the road south of here, at the hands of men I believe Castellan sent to silence us. Queen Isolde's composed expression cracked visibly at this, genuine alarm flashing across her features. Castellan sent men after you? She repeated sharply. I gave him no such order. I told him only to handle the matter of succession quietly, to ensure no scandal reached the public before we understood fully what Alara had discovered. Mira stepped forward now, watching the Queen's reaction carefully, searching for any sign of deception in her evident surprise. Your Majesty, she said carefully, is it possible Castellan has taken matters into his own hands, beyond whatever authority you granted him? The Queen's eyes flickered with something that resembled genuine fear now, an emotion Mira had not yet witnessed from her throughout the entire investigation. Edwin has served this family loyally for over 20 years, she said slowly, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. But I confess, these past weeks, his urgency regarding this matter has troubled me more than I initially admitted, even to myself. He argued forcefully against involving outside investigation from the very first hour, far more forcefully than simple concern for privacy would explain. Mira's mind raced through the implications of this revelation. If Castellan had exceeded whatever authority the Queen granted him, acting independently to eliminate the threat Alara represented to the succession he had sworn to protect, it suggested motives considerably more personal, and considerably more dangerous, than simple loyalty to the crown. What reason would Castellan have to act so aggressively on his own, beyond simple duty? Mira asked carefully. Queen Isolde considered the question for a long moment before answering, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she worked through the implications herself. Edwin has always been ambitious, she admitted slowly. His own family holds a distant claim to succession, extremely distant, barely worth mentioning under ordinary circumstances. But if the legitimacy of the current royal line were ever successfully challenged by proof of an unrecognized heir's descendants, the resulting instability might create opportunities for families with even the most distant claims to press their own interests forward, particularly if such a family had spent years positioning themselves carefully within the palace's own halls of power. The realization settled heavily over all three of them. Castellan's aggressive efforts to suppress the truth were not born from loyalty to the crown at all, but rather from fear that the truth, once revealed, might create exactly the kind of political chaos his own family could exploit to advance a claim of their own, however distant and unlikely it might currently appear. We need to move quickly, Mira said firmly. If Castellan believes Alara still poses an active threat, and now believes we have escaped his men and possibly located proof within this very archive, he will act with even greater urgency and recklessness than before. Queen Isolde nodded slowly, her earlier composure now fully replaced by genuine, focused concern. Then let us discuss, together, exactly how such truth should be handled, she said quietly, before Edwin discovers we've spoken at all, and before he takes any further action against Alara or the rest of you. It was not full trust, not yet, but it was a beginning, a fragile alliance, formed hastily out of shared danger rather than earned confidence. The three of them spent the following hour working quickly through the archive's remaining shelves, searching for any additional documentation that might further strengthen Margaretta's journal as concrete, undeniable proof, while Queen Isolde explained, with a candor Mira had not expected, the full weight of the secret she had carried since first learning of it herself, decades earlier, from her own mother-in-law shortly before assuming her role as queen. The hidden heir, she explained, had been born to a younger sibling of a king, several generations past, a relationship considered scandalous at the time, due to circumstances the journal only partially explained, involving a marriage the royal court had never formally recognized. Rather than risk the political instability such a revelation might cause, the child had been quietly given into the care of a trusted family along the coast, raised away from palace life entirely, their true heritage deliberately obscured from public record. Over the generations, Queen Isolde continued, this secret had been passed carefully from one generation of royal caretakers to the next, always with the same justification, protecting the stability of the current line of succession from any potential challenge. however unlikely such a challenge might realistically be after so much time had passed. As they worked, a sudden noise from the corridor outside made all three of them freeze once again. This time, however, the footsteps carried a different rhythm, quicker, more urgent, accompanied by the faint jingle of keys and the low murmur of at least two voices speaking in hushed, hurried tones. "Someone else is coming," Damien whispered urgently, extinguishing the lantern once more, as they pressed themselves quickly into the shadows behind the tallest shelving unit, near the back of the archive. The door burst open moments later, revealing not one figure this time, but two. Edwin Castellan stood in the doorway, his usually composed expression now tight with barely controlled urgency. A second man beside him whom Mira recognized immediately as one of the hooded riders from the previous night's ambush, his cloak now removed, revealing the unmistakable insignia of a private guard, sworn to Castellan's own household, rather than the crown itself. "The archive door has been unlocked recently," Castellan said sharply to his companion, his eyes scanning the darkened room with obvious suspicion. "Someone has been here." Mira's heart pounded fiercely as she pressed herself further into the shadows, exchanging a tense, silent glance with Damien and the Queen beside her. Whatever confrontation lay ahead, it seemed it would arrive considerably sooner, and considerably more dangerously, than any of them had anticipated only moments before. For a long, tense moment, the archive remained silent, save for the sound of Castellan's careful footsteps moving deeper into the room, his companion close behind, a lantern raised high enough to cast long, wavering shadows across the towering shelves. Mira's hand tightened around the journal she still held, understanding clearly that revealing themselves now, without a clear plan, risked considerably more than simply confronting the Queen alone had. It was Queen Isolde who finally made the decision for them, stepping deliberately out from behind the shelving, with a composure that Mira could only admire, given the danger evidently surrounding them all. "Edwin," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the archive's shadowed silence. "I think it's time we spoke honestly, don't you?" Castellan startled visibly at her sudden appearance, though he recovered his composure with practiced speed, his expression shifting quickly into something carefully neutral. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "I wasn't aware you had reason to visit the archive so late. Is something troubling you?" Queen Isolde's expression hardened. "Don't play games with me, Edwin," she said sharply. "I know about the men you sent after my son and the detective on the southern road last night. I know your family's own distant claim to succession, a claim I foolishly never considered dangerous until tonight." Castellan's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, his eyes narrowing with something considerably colder than his earlier smooth diplomacy. "I don't know what you imagine you've discovered," he said, his voice losing its earlier warmth entirely. "But I would caution you, Your Majesty, against acting too hastily on assumptions that could prove considerably more dangerous than you currently realize." "Is that a threat?" Damien asked, stepping out from the shadows to stand firmly beside his mother, his hand resting purposefully near the hilt of his sword. Castellan's eyes flicked toward the prince, and for the first time, genuine calculation replaced his earlier composure entirely. "Your Highness," he said slowly, "I have served this family loyally for over 20 years. Everything I have done to protect this kingdom's stability, nothing more." "By silencing an innocent woman?" Mira asked sharply, finally stepping forward herself, the journal still clutched firmly in her hands. "By sending armed men to threaten a prince and a royal investigator on a public road? That is not protection, Councillor Castellan. That is treason, disguised as loyalty." Something shifted visibly in Castellan's expression at these words, calculation giving way, briefly, to something considerably more desperate. "You don't understand," he said, his voice tightening further. "If proof of that hidden heir's line ever became public, the resulting instability would tear this kingdom apart. Families across the realm scrambling to press whatever distant claims they might hold, plunging Varnholm into exactly the kind of chaos that destroyed weaker kingdoms in generations past. I have only ever tried to prevent such catastrophe. And your own family's claim," Queen Isolde said quietly, her voice carrying a sharp edge that cut cleanly through his justification. "Would that claim not benefit considerably from exactly the kind of instability you claim to fear so deeply?" The silence that followed confirmed everything none of them had wanted to fully believe. Castellan's jaw tightened, his hand drifting, almost imperceptibly, toward the blade at his side, his companion beside him shifting his weight in a manner that suggested he, too, understood the confrontation had reached a point beyond simple words. Before further violence could unfold, however, the archive door swung open once more, revealing several palace guards, summoned quietly by a message Osric had arranged before their group had ever separated on the southern road, anticipating precisely this kind of dangerous confrontation might eventually become necessary. Leading them was King Alaric himself, his expression grave as he took in the scene before him, the queen and prince standing united against his own trusted counselor, a journal held carefully in the hands of the investigator he had personally summoned only days earlier. "Edwin," the king said, his voice carrying quiet, devastating disappointment rather than anger. "Is it true?" Castellan's shoulders sagged visibly, the fight finally draining from his posture as he recognized, at last, that further denial served no purpose. "I only ever wished to protect this kingdom's stability," he said quietly, though the words now carried little conviction. "Perhaps, in the end, I protected only my own ambitions instead, disguised carefully enough that even I nearly believed my own justifications until tonight." The guards moved forward at the king's signal, taking Castellan and his companion into custody, without further resistance. The counselor's decades of careful, patient positioning finally unraveling, within the space of a single, tense confrontation, inside a forgotten archive most of the palace had long since ceased to remember existed at all. As the guards led Castellan away, King Alaric turned toward his wife and son, his expression softening slightly despite the evident exhaustion and grief still etched across his features from the past terrifying week. "I want the full truth," he said quietly. "All of it. No more secrets, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth may prove." Queen Isolde nodded slowly, extending the leather-bound journal toward her husband with something that resembled genuine relief. "I believe it's finally time," she agreed. "Past time, if I'm honest with myself." Damien, meanwhile, turned toward Mira, his expression carrying profound gratitude despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his posture. "Elara," he said suddenly, urgency returning sharply to his voice. "We need to bring her home now. Safely and publicly, so no further danger can ever threaten her again." Mira nodded firmly in agreement, already turning toward the archive door. "Then let's not waste another moment," she said. "This kingdom has kept its secrets buried long enough. It's time to finally bring both the truth and Princess Elara herself safely into the light." Word was sent immediately to the safe house near the harbor district, and within hours, arrangements had been carefully made to bring Elara back to the palace, under circumstances designed to protect her safety, while beginning the delicate process of addressing the kingdom's long-hidden secret, publicly and honestly, exactly as her own courage in confronting that secret had ultimately demanded. Elara's return, when it finally occurred later that same day, drew an overwhelming response from a kingdom that had spent weeks fearing the worst regarding her fate. Crowds gathered along the palace gates the moment word spread that the missing princess had been found safe, their relief evident in the joyful cheers that rose as her carriage passed slowly through the capital's streets. Elias, riding proudly beside her, as her carriage moved steadily toward the palace gates, his role in her safety no longer a secret, requiring careful concealment. Yet Elara's return was not without its complications. Reporters and officials alike demanded explanations for her sudden disappearance, questions Mira and Damien had anticipated carefully in the hours before her arrival, preparing a careful, honest account that acknowledged the frightening circumstances surrounding her decision to flee, including, for the first time, a measured and dignified acknowledgement of the ancient secret at the heart of everything that had happened, delivered personally by King Alaric himself, in a brief address to the assembled crowd. Among the reporters gathered that day stood Priya Ashford, her careful, patient observation, throughout the entire ordeal, finally rewarded with the full, honest story she had suspected lay beneath the surface from the very beginning. She would go on to write the definitive account of the affair, an account praised throughout the kingdom for its fairness and precision, earning her a reputation that would follow her throughout the remainder of her distinguished career. Elias Farrow, whose loyalty and quick thinking had ultimately protected Elara throughout her time in hiding, received full pardon and recognition for his role in ensuring her safety, a decision Damien insisted upon personally, understanding fully the debt his family owed to the young guard's courage and discretion throughout the entire ordeal. In the weeks that followed, the palace worked carefully alongside trusted historians and legal scholars to determine exactly how the truth of the hidden heir should be addressed formally, ultimately deciding upon a dignified acknowledgement of the family's complicated history, framed not as scandal, but as an important, previously unknown chapter of the kingdom's broader story, deserving of honest recognition rather than continued shame or secrecy. Edwin Castellan faced formal trial for his actions, the evidence against him, including testimony from the two men who had ambushed Damien and Mira on the southern road, proving conclusive enough to ensure he would never again hold any position of influence within Varnholm's royal court. Corinne, upon learning that her family's long-guarded secret had finally been handled with the honesty and care it deserved, returned cautiously to the capital, no longer forced to live in fear of discovery. She and Alara developed a quiet, meaningful friendship in the months that followed, bonded permanently by the shared weight of a secret they had both, in their own ways, helped bring safely into the light. Corinne continued her work as a skilled dressmaker, though now operating openly from a respected shop within the capital itself, no longer forced to hide any part of her family's remarkable history. Her craftsmanship soon sought after by families throughout the kingdom, who admired both her considerable skill and her family's quiet, generations-long loyalty to a truth finally allowed to breathe freely. Queen Isolde and Alara's relationship remained complicated throughout this process. The trust between them fractured significantly by everything that had transpired, yet slowly, carefully, beginning to rebuild through consistent honesty and mutual effort. Neither had shown one another before Alara's disappearance forced such difficult truths into the open. "I understand now why you feared revealing this secret so deeply," Alara admitted to Queen Isolde during a quiet afternoon, nearly a year after her return, as they walked together through the palace gardens where so much fear and uncertainty had once unfolded. "I believed, for a long time, that you saw me only as a threat to protect against." Queen Isolde considered her words carefully before responding. "I saw you as a threat because I failed, for far too long, to recognize you as family," she admitted honestly. "That failure nearly cost us both everything that matters most, and very nearly allowed a man motivated by nothing more than his own ambition to destroy this entire kingdom's stability from within. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that we found our way back from that mistake, before it proved too late to repair." Their relationship, while never perfect, continued strengthening steadily in the years that followed, a testament to the power of honesty over secrecy, and forgiveness over lingering suspicion. Mira Solheim's involvement in the case continued for several weeks beyond Alara's return, as she assisted the palace's legal advisors in fully documenting the evidence against Castellan, and ensuring every remaining question surrounding the investigation received a thorough, satisfying answer. She returned once more to review her notes carefully, tracing back through every detail she had gathered throughout the investigation, ensuring no smaller thread remained unexplained, before considering the case fully, finally closed. One detail in particular had nagged persistently at the back of her mind since her earliest examination of the bloodstained veil, a small inconsistency regarding the timing of Elias's injury that she had not yet fully resolved. She sought him out directly, finding him now settled comfortably within the palace guard once again, his earlier fears of punishment replaced with quiet gratitude for the pardon and recognition he had received. She approached the question carefully, unwilling to reignite unnecessary suspicion after everything the royal family had already endured. "I have one final detail I need clarified," she explained honestly. "The injury on your hand, the one that stained Alara's veil. Can you tell me exactly when it occurred?" Elias considered the question carefully before answering. "Earlier that evening, actually," he admitted. "During preparations, before the ceremony itself began, I caught my hand on a loose nail while adjusting equipment near the tower stairwell. It wasn't until later, once Alara and I began finalizing our escape plan following her confrontation with the Queen, that we realized the injury could serve a useful purpose in staging the scene convincingly." Mira nodded slowly, satisfied with the simple, logical explanation that resolved the small inconsistency she had noticed. Confirmation that the careful planning behind Alara's escape had been resourceful, rather than suspicious, born of genuine fear, rather than any deeper deception she had not yet uncovered. She shared her findings honestly with Damien and Alara during a quiet dinner arranged shortly afterward, partly to formally close her involvement in the case, and partly because a genuine friendship had developed between them throughout the intensity of the investigation's final weeks. I wanted to be certain every detail made sense before considering this case fully closed, Mira explained, watching as both Damien and Alara listened attentively to her explanation regarding the timeline of Elias's injury. Alara smiled warmly, genuine appreciation evident in her expression. "Thank you for your thoroughness," she said sincerely. "Throughout this entire ordeal, you were the only person who consistently prioritized finding the truth over protecting appearances or avoiding uncomfortable questions. I don't believe we would have found our way through this safely without your persistence, and I certainly don't believe Castellan's ambitions would have ever come to light without your willingness to keep asking questions long after most investigators would have declared the case satisfactorily resolved." Damien nodded in agreement, raising his glass slightly in a small, informal toast. "To truth," he said simply, "and to the people brave enough to pursue it, regardless of how uncomfortable or dangerous that pursuit might become." Mira accepted the sentiment graciously, though she reminded them both gently that the true courage throughout this ordeal belonged primarily to Alara herself, whose difficult decision to flee, rather than remain silent, had ultimately protected not only her own life, but potentially prevented far greater harm that might have resulted from Castellan's ambitions remaining hidden and unchecked indefinitely. Months passed following the resolution of Alara's disappearance, and the kingdom of Varnholm gradually settled into a new understanding of its own history, one shaped by honesty, rather than the careful secrecy that had governed royal affairs for generations before. Citizens throughout the kingdom, rather than viewing the revelation as a threat to their monarchy's legitimacy, largely responded with curiosity, and even a measure of pride, recognizing the courage required for their royal family to finally confront and acknowledge a complicated truth long kept hidden, and recognizing, too, the genuine danger their beloved princess had faced, and survived, in pursuit of that same honesty. Historians began carefully documenting the full story, ensuring that Margaretta's journal, along with Corinne's family history, received proper recognition within the kingdom's broader historical record, a record that now included, for the first time, honest acknowledgement of the hidden heir's descendants, quietly invited to step forward and claim recognition, however modest, within a family history that had denied them for far too long. Elias Pharaoh's loyalty and quick thinking during the crisis earned him rapid advancement within the palace guard, eventually rising to a position of significant trust and responsibility, working closely alongside Damien in matters concerning the kingdom's security. His friendship with Alara remained strong throughout the years that followed, a bond forged through shared danger and mutual trust that neither ever took for granted. Damien and Alara's marriage, which had begun under such traumatic and uncertain circumstances, gradually blossomed into a genuine partnership built upon a foundation far stronger than the ceremony and celebration that had initially united them. Having faced such profound danger and uncertainty together, their bond deepened considerably, tempered by shared experience into something more resilient than either might have developed through an ordinary, uneventful beginning to married life. Alara embraced her evolving role within the kingdom with a renewed sense of purpose, particularly dedicating herself to supporting transparency and honest historical documentation within the royal court, determined that future generations would never again feel forced into the kind of desperate, dangerous choices her own discovery had once required of her, nor face the kind of hidden, ambitious danger that Castellan's long-concealed betrayal had so nearly allowed to succeed. On the first anniversary of Alara's disappearance, a small private gathering was held within the palace gardens, attended only by those who had played essential roles throughout the investigation: Damien, Alara, Queen Isolde, King Alaric, Elias, Corinne, Osric, and Mira herself. It was Alara who suggested the gathering, wishing to mark the occasion not with sorrow over the fear and danger they had all endured, but with genuine gratitude for the truth and understanding that had ultimately emerged from such difficult circumstances. Standing together beneath the same oak tree where Damien had once waited anxiously for news of his missing bride, the group reflected quietly on how dramatically circumstances had changed over the course of that single transformative year. "I used to believe that protecting this family meant guarding its secrets at any cost," Queen Isolde said thoughtfully, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the gathering. I understand now that true protection comes instead from honesty, even when that honesty proves difficult or uncomfortable to embrace. And I understand too how close we came to losing everything by trusting the wrong person with that comfortable, dangerous silence for far too long. Alara reached for Damien's hand gently as she responded, her voice carrying quiet conviction. And I believe that whatever challenges this kingdom faces in the future, we will meet them far more successfully now, standing together in truth, than we ever could have while continuing to hide behind carefully maintained secrets and fear. As the sun began setting gently over the palace gardens, casting warm golden light across the small gathering, Mira found herself reflecting once more on the remarkable journey this case had taken, from a terrifying disappearance on what should have been the happiest night of a young woman's life, to the uncovering of secrets buried across generations, to a dangerous confrontation with hidden ambition inside a forgotten archive, to the rebuilding of trust and family bonds that had once seemed irreparably broken. The blood-stained veil that had once symbolized fear, violence, and uncertainty now rested safely within the palace's historical archive, no longer a symbol of tragedy, but rather a powerful reminder of the courage required to face difficult truths honestly, and the strength that could ultimately be found in choosing transparency over the comfortable, dangerous silence of secrets kept hidden for far too long. And as the kingdom of Varnholm continued moving forward, shaped permanently by the lessons learned throughout that extraordinary year, the story of Princess Alara's wedding night disappearance became not merely a tale of fear and mystery, but ultimately a lasting testament to the enduring power of truth, trust, and the courage required to finally bring long-buried secrets safely into the light.